Okay. Apologies for the delay. I don't see anybody waiting, so serves me right for keeping you waiting there for 10 minutes. I just had a few wee tech issues with the laptop. Right, so I've been using this lockdown time, and even before that, I've been taking some time to brush up on my history, my Irish history, and of course my Irish language as well, but that's a different story. I picked up this book in the library the other day. It's called Bitter Freedom, Ireland in a Revolutionary World, 1918 to 1923, by Maurice Walsh. It came out in 2015. A new history of the Irish Revolution, placing Ireland within the global disorder born of the First World War, is the blurb on the back. For too long, the story of Irish independence and its aftermath has been told within an Anglo-Irish context. In Bitter Freedom, Maurice Walsh shows that Ireland was part of a civilization in turmoil, and how, in the era of Bolshevism and jazz, developments in Europe and America had a profound effect on Ireland, influencing the attitudes and expectations of combatants and civilians, their hopes, dreams, and bitter disappointments. So yeah, I thought it'd be an interesting read because it would pick up a wee bit of European history, or it would tie in with whatever European and world history I knew. So there was one, yeah. Oh, hi guys. There's Graham and Sola. Thanks for joining me. So I was going to read a wee section about the virtual republic, which is something, an aspect of that history. It's the setting up of a parallel administration in 1919 after the Doyle election. No, it wasn't the Doyle election. Well, the general election of 1918, December 1918, and then the first Doyle met on, I think it was the 21st of January 1919, and then this section I'm going to read is just what happened afterwards, but not based on the military aspects of the Civil War, but more the setting up of a parallel administration. Was I think it's a part that gets over. You know, we don't turn. It was at least 50% off. Well, you could argue backwards and forwards, but it was a major aspect of what got us our independence. The fact that we set up this alternative government system. Okay, so there is timeout, no chat. I haven't got to your email yet. I'm a bit of an easy day effort, but I'm logged on now. I'll get back to you. So this is page 134. The independence movement was also pulled in two directions on the question of how to respond to the indifference of the world and the inattention of the British government. Earlier they talked about how a representative had gone over to the Paris peace conference and had been unsuccessful in getting much of an audience. Okay, it could continue. This is the independence movement. It could continue the violent assaults on the police in order to make Ireland ungovernable, as the more extreme wing of the movement argued, or, as those who believed in passive resistance urged, it could extend the reach of the Doyle so that it would seem, both to people in Ireland as well as to visitors, less like a theatrical gesture and more like a functioning government. Despite his reputation as a guerrilla mastermind, Michael Collins believed in both strategies. While some men lay in fields behind ditches waiting to shoot policemen, others were typing memos and instructions about the correct procedures for conducting business in Dáil Éireann, or carefully filling ledgers and account books with the figures on income and expenditure by Dáil departments. Collins lavished as much attention on recruiting accountants, lawyers, typists, and clerks as he did on finding hitmen. Candidates for civil service posts had to sit examinations, just like their British counterparts, after replying to advertisements concealing the true nature of the position offered. Far more people came to know the revolution by banal encounters with its civil side than ever came face to face with an IRA ambush. The business of what Sinn Féin propagandists called constructive work was carried out in offices and private houses, bars, hotels, and village halls all over the country. Where was I? All over the... In Dublin, on any given day, messengers could locate Arthur Griffith, the leader of Sinn Féin, sipping from a glass of whisky in the Bailey pub in Duke Street, or, failing that, in the Ship in Abbey Street. Other men, less well known than Griffith, walked the streets of the city in bowler hats and sober suits and ties, carrying thousands of pounds to pay the salaries of the Doyle officials. One of them was known as the Walking Bank. The president received a salary of £500 and ministers £350. Members of Doyle Earn were paid hotel and travelling expenses. At the height of its activities, the Doyle was employing 300 people, a fraction of the 12,000 employees of Dublin Castle, but a sign of how bureaucratic validity was as important to these orderly agitators as revolutionary elan. Sorry, I got a bit of a sore throat. Bit of a croaky throat there. Much of this work had to be pursued covertly because of the danger of arrest and disruption. Even when the Doyle was tolerated, its officers knew that their mail was censored and kept secret cupboards at the back of Sinn Féin's office in Harcourt Street to protect sensitive paperwork from being confiscated. After the Doyle was declared illegal in September 1919, its members convened in private houses around Dublin. Officials of the departments of state the Assembly had established, fisheries, home affairs, local government, trade and commerce, worked in rooms all over the city, rented under cover names. Many departments were run from offices on the quays overlooking the River Liffey. As they clattered downstairs and stepped into the misty winter evenings to make their way home, like so many prufrocks, the civil servants of the underground government were likely to catch sight of one of their ministers passing by on his bicycle. After coming from Wexford to watch the inaugural session of the Doyle, Moira Comerford had stayed on to work for the revolution. She now possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of these ministerial bicycles. Michael Collins rode a large framed Lucania. If she saw a green Pierce leaning against the wall in a hallway, that's Pierce, P-I-E-R-C-E, leaning against the wall in a wall in a hallway, she knew she would know that the Minister for Defence, Cathal Brugha, was in the building. And if in the murky evening she caught sight of a piece of string dangling from the rear rack of a bicycle whooshing by, she could be almost certain that it was Desmond Fitzgerald, Minister for Propaganda. Even a French journalist, probably tutored by Fitzgerald, learned to recognise a cheerfully juvenile figure which Fitz passed on a muddy bicycle in a faded waterproof and a little cleft hat dripping under the pelting rain as a revolutionary minister. If visiting French journalists could spot members of the underground Irish government spinning through Dublin streets, it is inconceivable that the British could not do so as well. In some cases, they left the revolutionaries to get on with their business because it suited them. Griffith, for instance, was regarded as a moderate, somebody whom they might have to negotiate with, so he was largely left to sip his whisky unmolested. He was even able to plant a ceremonial tree on the day designated by the Doyle as National Arbour Day on the 29th of November 1919. That's just 2 months after it was declared illegal. Officers of the Dublin Metropolitan Police sympathised with the revolutionaries and allowed them to pass unhindered, but they had also devised elaborate procedures to evade arrest and conceal their papers and networks. When rural deputies were required in Dublin for a meeting of Doyle Earn, a letter would be sent to a girl who knew them, apparently from a boyfriend, inviting her to Dublin for an assignation on the chosen date. What was remarkable was how much business Doyle Earn was allowed to carry on in plain sight, enhancing its appearance to the public as the de facto government of Ireland. Griffith's planting of the tree was the culmination of a public campaign to restore Ireland's forestry. In addition to a series of lectures, thousands of leaflets were circulated urging every farmer to plant a tree for each man executed in 1916. A captured memorandum from Griffiths arguing that the British government had failed to develop Irish fisheries, prompted the commander of British forces, General Macready, to suggest to the government in London that it should start a new programme that would, quotes, cut the ground from under. Sorry, the screen had a press key there. Cut the ground from under these people's feet. This was just one example of the chronic indecision about whether to compete with the revolutionaries or suppress them. Griffith, who had always supported the idea of creating a parallel civil service as the nucleus of an alternative state, assembled 49 businessmen, professors and scientists to travel the country taking evidence on what could be done to stimulate Ireland's industries and natural resources. Their first public hearings were disrupted by the police, but after a public outcry over the suppression of such an obviously well-intentioned undertaking, they were permitted to hear submissions for an entire week when they reassembled in Dublin City Hall. That's to stimulate the industries and natural resources. Okay. Irish newspapers were forbidden to report the hearings, but British and foreign journalists were allowed to publicise the earnest work of the committee. The following month, the inquiry moved to Cork. Its proceedings were banned, and the whole cycle of tolerance and repression began again. Another institution of the Doyle that was harassed but not suppressed was the Land Bank, which lent money to tenant farmers seeking to buy out landlords who were ready to sell. It was a legally constituted company that raised £325,000, much of it from the United States, held in the bank accounts of English cooperatives. Prospective depositors were soberly informed that not only would they be acting patriotically, but that their money would be safe in the hands of reasonable men who would put it to good use, not only in the interest of the country, but to provide a good return and first-class security for yourself. So that means it would get some interest, bear some interest. When soldiers arrived to search the offices of the Land Bank, the manager, Lionel Smith Gordon, played cards with the officer in charge, while accountants inspected the books. Only one account was closed down. Smith Gordon, a promoter of cooperatives and an Oxford graduate who was an example of how Doyle Earn was able to co-opt progressive members of the ascendancy class, believed the bank survived because there was some, as he says in inverted commas, something in English psychology which inspires a respect for financial institutions. What's up, Paul O'Neill? Bullies in uniform, the Black and Tans are back with their leader, Drew Harris. Why are Garda hiring from outside the jurisdiction? Good question, sir. The Highmore piece. Don't know why, Marcus. Conor, not so old. Yeah, more piece. I'm going to give you an email, and we're going to try and do. Hopefully, we can do a conversation. I can introduce you to some educationalists in the movement, and maybe we'll do a stream about it. Okay, so this is longer than I remember. Actually, you okay with this so far? Anyway, keep going. The Land Bank had been financed by the spectacular success of a campaign to fund the activities of the Doyle by issuing Republican bonds. The bond issue, itself the mark of a real modern state, was advertised in newspapers, on flyers, handed out at church gates, and through slogans painted on walls all over the country. Sinn Féin organisers were sent from house to house to persuade or threaten people to buy the bonds, although their diligence was variable, and Michael Collins confessed that trying to manage them almost broke his heart. Newspapers carrying information about the bonds risked being shut down, so the Doyle prepared its own propaganda film. A showing of Charlie Chaplin's latest feature might be interrupted by Irish volunteers who had ordered the reel operator to halt the film. The cinema goers were then invited to watch a short film advertising the Republican bonds. A smiling Michael Collins in a suit and tie was shown receiving checks and signing the bonds on a block of wood reputedly used to behead the 19th century patriot rebel Robert Emmet. The camera lingered on a letter of support from a Catholic bishop pledging £100. Then the mother of Patrick Pearse led a procession of widows of fallen martyrs and members of the Doyle to buy the bonds from Collins and his assistant, who looked like a pair of friendly bank clerks drumming up business at a fete. After 7 minutes, the reels were changed and the Chaplin film resumed. In the meantime, Michael Collins was imprinted on the public mind. In Ireland, the campaign collected nearly £372,000, 50% more than its target. Small farmers subscribed in large numbers. Some unionists invested in the bonds, possibly as an insurance policy, to protect themselves from intimidation, or in some cases, out of sympathy and the conviction that they might receive a good return. The loan drive impressed visiting journalists, the Daily Herald concluding that despite all the attempts to suppress the Doyle, the underground government commands the unforced obedience of the Irish people, quote. But the most visible sinews of the Republican state began to appear towards the end of 1919 with the establishment of the Doyle Courts. The notion of ignoring the regular courts and launching a system of parallel justice based on arbitration and popular goodwill instead of archaic procedures had long been part of Sinn Féin policy. Repudiation of British justice became a commonplace, as Republicans in the dock, quote unquote, refused to recognise the courts, unquote. In some areas, arbitration courts had already appeared to settle land disputes in which owners were threatened and cattle driven from fields onto the roads. Now Doyle officials realised that the burned out police stations marking large swathes of rural Ireland signified not just the gradual defeat and retreat of the RIC, but a vacuum of authority. Courts of some kind were a necessity to prevent the spread of lawlessness. The extension of the Doyle Courts across the country turned out to be hugely popular because they were a credible guarantee of order. Hearings were held in halls or schools, in towns or in creameries, farmhouses and even outhouses and barns in the country. Crimes prosecuted included petty theft, sheep rustling and desertion by husbands of their wives. Interesting. In Kildare, 2 men who stole cattle belonging to the British government were banished from the county for 9 months and 3 months. A Protestant in Longford brought a neighbour before a Republican court, quote, for malicious injury to his hat, which the neighbour had struck with an ash plant, unquote. The defendant was ordered to buy a new hat of the plaintiff's choosing. In Roscommon, a wealthy Irish-American farmer was successfully sued by his niece for 7.5 years' pay for her work as a housekeeper. A packed house in Cork City Hall watched a case in which a priest was charged with slander. His accuser prevailed and was awarded damages of 1 shilling. There was no law against arbitration hearings, but when the courts styled themselves as a fully fledged judiciary of the Republic, trying criminal cases with a High Court, Supreme Court, and a whole apparatus of judges, clerks, and registrars serving arrest warrants and summonses, they were declared illegal, and the police and military set out to suppress them. Elaborate precautions were taken to enable clandestine sittings. One judge had a reputation for convening his court at midnight, relishing the power to force witnesses out of their beds as much as evading the police. Kevin O'Shiel, a barrister who became a key figure in the court system, travelled the country posing as a salesman for a heat rub ointment that would treat all ailments. His alias, his alias, Robert E. Seal, was chosen so that if a policeman asked him if he was O'Shiel, he could say he was mistaken. Another judge deposited his case notes on loose leaves with his mother in case he was arrested and searched. The courts called on IRA volunteers to enforce their judgments and arrest suspects. Without recourse to prisons, offenders were held in outhouses or threatened with violence unless they left the locality. In Kilkenny, 2 men were held for a burglary at the residence of a retired British Army major and released only after returning most of the stolen goods. A man convicted of stealing mailbags and assaulting his father was forced to spend a week on a farm spreading manure. Some prisoners reported that they were treated well and supplied with good food, cigarettes, and newspapers. The head of the Republican police force later recalled that he had asked his superiors for permission to flog, quote, incorrigible criminals, unquote, but was turned down because it was considered barbarous. As they gained confidence, the courts and the volunteers took pride in punishing crimes the police had failed to solve. The new regime also indulged its puritanical streak. Pubs that kept lax hours were shut down. Bookmakers were escorted from GAA grounds. People caught smoking foreign cigarettes had their clothing slashed. Swiftly, the traditional court network was immobilized. Magistrates arrived at courthouses to find no defendants and no prosecution cases prepared. That's a good, Marcus has just spotted your comment there. Arbitration is to all intents breaking law. So, I don't really know my history of the period after this, but it will be interesting for me to find out to what extent that arbitration extended beyond this revolutionary period or the virtual republic of 1919. Maybe you can answer if you know something. I think you might have some experience in that field. Magistrates arrived at courthouses to find no defendants and no prosecution cases prepared. Lawyers who should have appeared before them were now defending their clients in the Republican courts. When Sinn Féin took control of a majority of local councils in the elections of 1920, official business was also transferred to the underground courts. Republican judges now heard applications to commit people to asylums, or were asked to deliver judgments against citizens defaulting on their local taxes. One county council closed all courthouse buildings and instructed volunteers not to allow judges to enter them. This represented the benign end of a campaign to enforce a boycott of the British system. A notice appeared on a courthouse door in the town in Kerry, warning that anybody entering would be shot. None of the 63 people who had been summoned to appear turned up. Judges were refused hotel rooms in some towns. In Skibbereen, Jasper Wolfe became a marked man because he continued to act as Crown prosecutor. His brother Willie, a justice of the peace, had his shop boycotted and notices were pinned to his door, warning him to resign or face the consequences. Many courthouses, which were once the scene of witty legal theatrics, were now uninviting fortresses protected by sandbags, barbed wire, and machine guns. Throughout the summer of 1920, hundreds of magistrates resigned, and by the autumn, the system had virtually collapsed. Lord Justice O'Connor told a grand jury in County Clare that failure to obtain evidence was, quote, an extraordinary and anomalous state of affairs without parallel among any other of the white races inhabiting the British Empire, unquote. Even Unionists and opponents of Sinn Féin were finding the Republican courts effective. Landowners were delighted to find that the courts would order intruders to clear off their estates. Substantial farmers who found the police too preoccupied to track down their stolen cattle discovered that the personnel of the underground courts were able to secure the return of their livestock. The fairness of the procedures and judgments in the courts was praised by Irish peers in the House of Lords and letters to the newspapers. During his cycling tour of Ireland in 1920, when he noted the burnt police stations dotting the landscape, Dennis Johnson and his friends also observed that the areas that seemed to be the most peaceful and ordered were those without a military presence. In County Clare, they received a good reception. Quote, every countryman had a pleasant nod or a cheery word for us, unquote. The only sign of trouble came from the convoys of soldiers passing them on the country roads or filling the streets of the towns. Quote, I personally noted a very great difference in their noisy demeanour from the quiet geniality of the people, he noted in his diary. And the fact of the matter is, they do no good at all. The Irish Republic is virtually established, and if anyone wants justice or protection, the only place he can get it is from the Sinn Féin authorities, and he does get it from them, unquote. I need more practice of my English accent, evidently. The success of the courts was an opportunity to turn around the image of a lawless regime that the British government had promoted. Foreign journalists were invited to observe court sessions. They watched sober and punctilious shopkeepers and teachers preside over orderly hearings in village halls and schoolrooms. Aggrieved farmers, repentant drunks, and angry young men accused of assault and burglary told their stories before enthralled spectators, who often had brushed their hair and freshened up after a day's work as if they were going out for an evening at the theatre. The improvised procedures impressed many visiting journalists. The courts seemed to retain their authority without the pomp and arcane legal language. More importantly, their work was clearly accepted. Quote, the people's own law, unquote, as one man told an American journalist. The overall impression... Oh, let me read Marcus's comment. I read Arbitration for Professional Studies. I wrote of the similarities with it and Brehon, as well as Sharia law. Good man, yourself. Minister of Justice. The overall impression created by the courts was that Doyle Erin was not just a make-believe government, but was capable of dealing in facts as much as dreams. The most basic practical functions of government, catching burglars, making the pubs close on time, were now being performed by Sinn Féin, not the British administration. Quote, the Sinn Féin tribunals are jostling British law into oblivion as a fast motorcar jostles foot passengers off the road, unquote, was the verdict of the Irish Times. Much as Irish perceptions mattered, demonstrating the reality of the Irish Republic to a British audience was even more important. In July 1920, the Daily Mail had jeered that, quote, Sinn Féin sets up law courts to keep the peace while policemen are being murdered, unquote. But just over a month later, the paper's correspondent concluded that the futility of trying to govern a people against its will is demonstrated by what happens at the Sinn Féin courts, unquote. The reasoning here was compelling. If Irish nationalists were no longer waiting for permission to govern themselves, then the British government was faced with the choice of either acknowledging the new state or destroying it. And that's the end of the chapter. So yeah, I came across that wee section. It's not even a full chapter. Well, thank God, says you. It's about 2/3 of a chapter. What's that? 10 pages odd. When you're reading it in public, it seems like that 10 pages seemed like 100 page. Yeah, no, I'm going to get back to you more, please. No worries. Yeah, so the interesting thing there is, for me, was just the amount of work involved in putting that up, and the fact that people had to step up and learn and take their experiences in life, and maybe even learn some, step up to the plate to become the shadow government. So the revolution, or the War of Independence, or the Tan War, well, the war was one side of it, but the shadow government was just as important. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. I mean, we tend to, the iconography and the mythology tends to glorify the soldiers, which of course, the participants in the, let me just turn that off. The participants in the military participants, and they played a very important role, but the civil side was equally as important. And this might be required of some of us in the future, who knows? So I think it's on all of us to increase our skills in areas like cultural areas, like, for example, the history and the language, the music and the arts, but also more prosaic matters like, for example, economics, so we can develop good economic arguments and be economically fluent. And I really didn't study any economics at school. So I really, even though I did a history A level, I bet you the end does a good English accent. Whether it's put on or real, we don't know. We'll never find out. Maybe we'll find out someday. Yeah, so that was it, really. I mean, if there's no questions or comments, we'll wrap it up. It's just coming up to the half-hour mark. Maybe nobody will listen to this ever again, but maybe I'll listen to it myself, see if we happen to read back through that. Thanks for your attention. Oh, Marcus's comment. This is what Lina was attempting in Mid and South Ulster. Jim Lina, yeah. Make the area ungovernable and ensure your own government. Yeah, I look forward to reading more about that. That would have been in the 70s and 80s. I guess. I was only a young cub. And the end's not so bad. I think the end's one of us. He's coming around to our way of thinking. Right, lads and lassies. Good Shiv Slán. Agus Tussahian. Tronono, see, Slángafoil, talk to you soon. Enjoy your evening. Oh, Mark Colette's on now at 7 p.m. Worth checking into, worth checking out. It's not our scrap, but it's worth listening to for picking up ideas for a movement. I think he's very organized. I don't agree with everything he says, but the organization and the professionalism is what I like there. All right, lads and lassies, talk to you soon. Cheers.